Greetings, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Peter Tierney, and I help direct science and religion programming at the Institute. I'd invite you to check out our website to learn more about upcoming events, including an event next week co-presented with the Holy See Mission to the United Nations commemorating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN. At lumenchristi.org, you can also join our mailing list and help financially support programs like this one. At Lumen Christi, we are committed to trying to bring the Catholic intellectual tradition into broader dialogue across disciplines and religious traditions. It is thus exciting to be partnering with the International Academy for Bioethical Inquiry to be hosting events that bring an integral understanding of the person to bioethics and related discussions. Now, in 2000, atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen and limnologist Eugene Stormer argued that our human impact on the globe has been so pervasive and significant that it merited the designation of a new geological epoch. Humans had left the Holocene and were now in what they dubbed the Anthropocene. Since then, the term has migrated across disciplines and from scientific journals into the popular media. And today's panel will help us better understand this term, how it captures challenges to our ethics, our understanding of human action and human health, and how our religious traditions are challenged and also can creatively respond. Now, moderating today's discussion and introducing our speakers is Dr. Jeff Bishop. Dr. Bishop is the Tenet Endowed Chair in Healthcare Ethics, Professor of Philosophy, and Professor of Theology at St. Louis University. He holds an MD from the University of Texas and a PhD in Philosophy from the University of Dallas. Jeff is also the founder and lead organizer of the International Academy for Bioethical Inquiry. Now with that, I'll invite Dr. Bishop to turn on his video and audio.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for working with us on this. A few months ago, we were going to have a meeting of the International Academy for Bioethical Inquiry in Chicago at the Lumen Christi Institute, and unfortunately, COVID got in the way of that. And so we decided to partner with Lumen Christi to put on these conversations. Let me say a little bit about the International Academy for Bioethical Inquiry. It's a group of scholars who really got tired of the kind of technocratic approach to bioethics, which often ends up just being the apologist for whatever medicine decides it wants to do, or the apologist for what the NIH decides is it wants to do. And we also know that the history of bioethics is a history that is rich with both theological and philosophical conversations, including thinkers like Alistair McIntyre, who at one point spoke vociferously into the world of bioethics, as did people like Hans Jonas. And in a way, we're trying to recapture that. And that's the purpose of today's conversation, is to broaden the horizons of bioethics and to try to get voices that are right beside bioethics to kind of speak into bioethics and to help us to think a little bit more clearly about where we are philosophically, theologically, intellectually, more broadly. And so to that end, we're putting on this conversation, Integral Bioethics in the Anthropocene. And so I'll be moderating a conversation. We have three distinguished panelists who will be speaking with us. I'll ask a series of questions to them, and at the end, we'll have some time for you to ask questions as well. So thanks for joining us, and we'll go ahead and move on. Our first panelist is Benjamin Defoe. Ben is the Bamboo Chair in Sustainability, and he's Professor of Atmospheric Science in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences here at St. Louis University. His research focuses on computer simulation of air pollution. After getting his PhD in engineering from Cambridge University, he worked with Dr. Mario Molina at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a project to improve air quality in Mexico City. He now researches air pollution in places ranging from St. Louis, East St. Louis to Tibet. And he teaches courses in climate change here at St. Louis University. Willis Jenkins, another of our panelists, lives in the Rivanna River watershed, where he works at the University of Virginia as professor of religion, ethics, and the environment, and he was also bemoaning the fact that he's also the department chair, which mainly means he does email now. He is the author of 2 award-winning books, however, Ecology of Grace, which won a Templeton Award for theological promise, and The Future of Ethics, which won the American Academy of Religion Award for excellence as well. Our third panelist is Simone Katva. She was research fellow most recently at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and has recently been appointed to a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Oslo in the Faculty of Theology, where she works on the transdisciplinary environmental humanities project, which is called The Ambivalence of Nordic Nature, Gift, Guilt, Grace. Simone is the author of Effort and Grace on the Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy, which just came out this year. And she has published widely on French spiritualism, ecological thinking, and the philosophy of attention, especially in the work of Simone Bay. With Atlas Tarbuck, she is currently completing a book addressing attention to spiritual technology for the transformation of the earth. And I think the project is called Spellbound for a Damaged Planet, Magic and Ecology. So I invite all of you to turn on your microphones now and your cameras. Okay, there's Simone. Okay, great. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. And Ben, I'm going to start with you to kind of get a sense of what the Anthropocene is. What do we mean by that? And what is the data supporting the claims behind the call of the Anthropocene? What's captured behind the concept?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you to the Lumen Christi Institute for this opportunity to take part in the panel. Thank you for everybody zooming in. I want to answer, take a little bit of an angle on this question. The Anthropocene was more recently suggested by Paul Crutzen, like Peter mentioned at the beginning, who received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. But I want to talk about the scientist that he shared the prize with, which is who is Mario Molina. And unfortunately, Mario Molina passed away just last week. So I urge you to dig behind the news headlines and to read about his wonderful life. So I had the great pleasure of working for Mario Molina at MIT on the Mexico City project. And I think he was really a model scientist for this fractious age, seeking to do the best science possible, making it relevant to problems facing humanity, and having the courage to take the results from the lab to the powers that be. So I think that song attributed to St. Francis, "Make me a channel of your peace," and there's a great line in the middle there, that I may seek not so much to be understood as to understand. And I think Mario was very fond of asking naive questions and running through thought experiments to think things through. So the story begins, however, before Mario, with someone who deserves to be remembered as the arch villain of the 20th century, and you may not even know who he is, Thomas Midgley. His inventions led to not one, but 2 global environmental catastrophes: tetraethyl lead and chlorofluorocarbon, listed on a Times list of 50 worst inventions ever, and he is responsible for 2 of them. So before we move from that, let me, so if you were born before 1990, then Thomas Midgley cost you at a minimum several IQ points from all the lead in your brain. And as for CFCs, there were none in the earth before him, and they seemed totally safe at first. So then we enter James Lovelock, who would later propose the Gaia hypothesis. Lovelock thought, this is great. We have a natural experiment with these CFCs. They've never been in the environment before. We're releasing them. So I could measure them and I could track them all around the world. So let me ask you, how many fine grains of sand do you think would fit around the equator? You know, if this were class, you would all flood the chat with your estimates and we could talk about them. We won't do that here. It turns out it's about 1 trillion fine grains of sand around the equator. James Lovelock built an instrument so that if he had 1 trillion air molecules and only one of them was a CFC molecule, then he could detect it. And so by measuring these tiny amounts of CFCs, he was able to track the spread of pollution in the atmosphere and into the oceans. So at this point then now we come to the main hero, Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland, who thought about this, and they asked a naive question. If nothing happens to CFCs in the environment, then what does happen to them? Something must happen to them. And what they found in the lab is that even tiny amounts in the atmosphere would lead to destruction of the ozone layer in the stratosphere. And seeing the importance of their results, they put their career on the line really to call for a ban on CFCs. And this led to one of the most effective environmental treaties ever, the Montreal Protocol of 1987. So it's outstanding science, outstanding courage to do something for the benefit of people. So there's many ways of illustrating the Anthropocene. You could spend all day with graphs. This story highlights just one story out of many. We've reached a point where everywhere you look on Earth, you'll find the effects of humans. And often that effect is damaging to life. So sometimes it's like tetraethyl lead. People knew lead was a powerful neurotoxin. They knew this was dangerous and they turned the other way. Sometimes it's like CFCs. It's seemingly miraculous compound that was later found to be damaging to parts of the Earth we maybe didn't even know existed, even though we depend on them entirely for our survival. So either way, that's the Anthropocene for you. We as humans now have the power to mess things up on Earth for every living being. And as Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland realized, with great power comes great responsibility.
Thanks for that history lesson and science lesson there. I appreciate it. Part of it I hadn't heard before. So Willis, you've argued that we are just, given the complexity of this, that we're just sort of almost morally incompetent in the face of human-caused climate change and other elements factoring into the Anthropocene. So can you lay that out a little bit and lay out the challenges to our ethical frameworks that we now are facing?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for moderating this, and thanks to Lumen Christi for this panel. So yeah, in a book, I talked about the incompetence of our moral traditions for making sense of unprecedented problems, climate change as exemplary among them. So just for example, if a fundamental part of your tradition is neighbor love, it's kind of a challenge to think about what it means to love neighbors through shared relations of a climate crisis that extends across generations and involves indirect aggregate causes, non-linear vulnerabilities. It's different from ordinary interpersonal interactions in a community or even a shared society. And so that's a real challenge to our traditions. And so then to our interpretive ability to recognize something like climate change as a problem. I could say more about that, but I think what I want to quickly move to say is there's a real moral hazard to that kind of observation, and I wish I had said that more in the book, especially in a North Atlantic context. It's as if, well, responsibility is just too complicated; it's too hard to think. There's two kinds of replies to that I briefly want to mention. One is it's one that Henry Shue, the philosopher of human rights, says in many contexts, which is basically, look, we have the concepts, we just don't want to apply them. It's just willful irresponsibility of non-accountable power. And I think he's largely right, not entirely right. I still think justice and rights, there's real challenges to those ideas, those concepts, but that's an important thing to remember. And secondly, the research that has come out just in the last few years about the intentional obstruction of political processes for creating accountability and of cultural processes through which moral communities would develop those competencies has become evident. So, for example, evangelical Christians in the North Atlantic working to expand neighbor love through climate relations have been met by fossil fuel funded resistance specifically aimed at their capacity inside their community, which is, that's cultural jamming at a deep level. It's been really effective. And I think we haven't really realized it for until the past few years, the extent to which this has been going on. And so now I would hold to the point of incompetence, but I would say there's certainly an element of planned incompetence, right? That there's this incompetence that is created and sustained by a kind of moral corruption. And that makes it all the more difficult to challenge this big problem, right? To step into this big problem. Yeah.
So there's moral incompetence in the sense of we don't have the resources to intellectually engage it, but then there's there are people and forces, corporations, whatever it might be, pushing in the other direction, such that we may not only not have the willpower to address it, but in fact they are giving all kinds of incentives in order to keep us from imagining an alternative. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, climate change is hard enough on its own without there being political actors that are attempting to undermine our capacities to build political and moral responsibility. Yes.
Yeah. So we've got this idea that we're participating. We've caused the Anthropocene. We've changed the way that the entire Earth is capable of behaving. And I'd like to hear Simone now think about, well, what does this do on ourselves? How does this come back to us, not just in terms of our biological health, but in our conceptions of our understanding of what it is to be human even?
This is a really good question. Thank you. I think on the one, so there are two things that the Anthropocene impacts about our understanding of the human. On the one hand, the term itself draws attention, obviously, to the human. This is in the name, anthropos, and it even aggrandizes it. So this is one of the negative criticisms of the term, that the Anthropocene holds up, even as it kind of points to the human as a culprit. It also promises a false promise of human-made techno-fixes as possible solutions to the planetary crisis, especially, of course, the false promises of particular Western ideals of what it is to be human, what human progress and achievement might look like. So there is this kind of glorification of geoengineering and human-made solutions as possible solutions. On the other hand, though, the epoch of time to which the Anthropocene refers has, of course, drawn attention away from those same ideals. So what I mean is the time in which we've been living for the last sort of 50 or 60 years has been a time in which we have had attention drawn away from these Western ideals of what it means to be human and to make progress. Lots of balloons and imaginations of human progress have been punctured. So we've turned our attention towards not only the vibrancy of animals and plants and non-human things, but to visions of interconnectedness and entangled life that one finds, for instance, in non-Western alternative ontologies, so-called, such as magic and animism, as well as in the pre-modern Christian mystical theology of figures like St. Francis and Hildegard of Bingen. There is this upsurging of a mystical theology that sees the entanglement of human and non-human and sort of de-centers essentially the human. So the thinking that's given rise to the term the Anthropocene was shaped by environmental philosophy, some of it pioneered by Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, who was here at Oslo University. And he argued that we are not the authors of our existence, that we depend on others, and so should begin to treat the non-human as not just other, but more than human. And I suspect this is why a certain kind of spiritual realism is having such an important moment in this epoch that's now called the Anthropocene, with both theologians and non-theologians drawing on the language and, more importantly, the cultures surrounding and that have given rise to animism. It's a moment of re-sacralization, sort of urgent, but also of decolonization. So the realization that human beings are not self-sufficient and that non-humans are not below or inferior to us is a realization brought on today by ecological thinking. And this is structurally homologous to the realization of dependency that in the past was generated by the experience of God in Christian mysticism, and that continues to be generated by the experience of the world, the environment surround in so many so-called traditional societies. So to answer your question, I think the way the Anthropocene has impacted our understanding of the human is simply by reminding us that the human is not, and indeed never could be, merely human. So and this is a realization that's not solely ontic, although it's deeply entrenched in the ontic, but it's also ontological. So this shows how hazardous it is to conduct environmental thought or activism without a view to metaphysics, to the more than human.
that's very interesting. So, I think that this poses a question for ethics in general, and I think it's partly what Willis was getting to, because ethics, well, I'll just use bioethics as the example. Bioethics, you can draw a line from essentially kind of the rise of Renaissance humanism up through the Enlightenment project, where certain humanisms come to the forefront. Even science itself is kind of born out of this sort of humanist thrust. And so I guess the question for us to think about is, well, how do we humans think non-humanly? How do we begin to get outside of our own heads, so to speak, our own imaginaries, in order to kind of actually reestablish ourselves as important, but not important to the whole, but not the masters and commanders of the whole. I mean, Willis, how do you think about that as a religious ethicist?
It's a great question that I so appreciate, because it gets right to the difficulty of the religious inheritances that I work with. Right. So I'm a scholar in Christian theology, Christian ethics. That's my training. And just like Simone said so well, you see so many scholars thinking from this inheritance, looking for ways to connect with non-modern cosmologies. And that might be pre-modern Christian cosmologies. That might be new forms of listening with indigenous cosmopolitics. That might be these kinds of practices that take us beyond the modern human imagination, that think about reciprocity and responsibility with non-human persons. All those, I mean, just a wide intellectual interest in that. And I would say, so let me just say, you have named what I take to be a significant intellectual challenge in my own career, and the way in which I've begun to work on it is in ways that would have been quite surprising to me earlier in my career. So I'm outside of archives and working with scientists and artists, thinking together about environmental change in what we call humanities labs, looking for ways to imagine intensified environmental change in landscapes that have all kinds of more than human actors in them, with questions that can come back to those basic things that Simone just raised. Like, how do we think about sort of who we are as humans within a broader cosmos? So let me just, to make me real specific, let me just give you one example, and then I'll pause. I work with scientists on Virginia's Eastern Shore, where we have a long-term ecological research project that's funded by the NSF to focus on coastal change. And so the scientists, they produce many white papers that not many people listen to, even though there's really dramatic coastal change happening there. The fastest sea level rise in the world, or it's 3 times faster than the global average. So I work with a musician to sonify data sets, so he can hear the data, and then we create performances from it. And then that just opens up for people whole other registers of affective response to disciplined study of what's happening in environmental change. And then, I think the wager is that opens new possibilities of cultural response to it as well. So anyway, that's the line of thinking that I've been going to, and I go on at some length there, Jeff, just to underscore how significant a challenge I think you have just named.
Yeah. I mean, it's the modern world is a product of the various humanisms that have grown up in the way that they did, right? And we've made the world thus, and where everything kind of revolves around us, but we're no longer in control of it, I think. And so I guess the question is, well, we all have to start figuring out ways to think the non-human, but we're still human. We're still stuck in our capacities and with our tools. And so I guess, I'd like to hear all of you think out loud about this, but specifically Ben, as a scientist. I mean, how does one climb outside of the scientific mindset, which is to some extent dependent upon the rise of philosophical humanism in the West, so to speak? So can we? What does that look like?
Climb outside of the scientific mindset?
Well, I mean, we need the science, there's no doubt. But there's got to be some way then to that sort of pulls us back in, not just intellectually, but pulls us back in as the kinds of animals that we are.
Right. And I liked what Willis was saying about making this, you know, the changes on the coast, making it visible to people. I think a lot of science is about seeing things, seeing, you know, just seeing things that present themselves to our senses directly and kind of making sense of them, but then also devising ever better instruments to see ever more things that are invisible to the eyes. And in a sense, there's a parallel there, I think, also with religion, that it, you know, seeing, there's one thing just seeing like a, you know, some monument there, and another to see with the eyes of the imagination, to see what does it mean, how does it come together. So that would be my, I guess, kind of answer to that, and how ecological science is interesting. It's quite different from bench science or lab science. Some of the pushback has come from physicists who are used to very precise, very controlled environments. When you're an atmospheric scientist, the lab is the atmosphere. You don't control it. You have to go out, you make measurements, and you hope that on when you've planned your field campaign, you get good results. And what will happen is nature will send you a curveball and you'll have an unexpected event happen. So it shows you, you know, how everything is connected and how really you can't just control, how you're at the mercy of things like that. And that's both kind of exciting and challenging at the same time.
Yeah, I guess in some ways the sort of quintessential way we think about science is this outside observer who controls everything and kind of keeps it steady. But there are older forms of science that maybe realize that we are entangled, that actually the Earth and atmospheric science folks are having to actually realize that there aren't controlled experiments and that there are things that are out of control. So I wonder, I know Simone has done some work historically. Are there historical figures that we can turn to that might kind of, I'm thinking maybe Nicholas of Cusa or some of the patristic thinkers who had a different, a much broader way of understanding humanity as entangled. Can you speak to some of that maybe?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. I think that, so the work that I've been doing myself recently has been looking at, as Willis was saying, on the one hand, pre-modern Western thinkers who had a more sort of entangled view of the world, the Christian mystical tradition. I've been particularly interested in the spiritual exercise tradition, because there you get, so we're talking about from the patristic period onwards into the early modern period, and also carries on into the 18th century and so on. But thinkers like Johannes Climacus, patristic period, who write spiritual manuals for how to basically, draw close to God. And one of the recurring features in this literature is the comparison made between the person who prays and a plant or a non-human animal. I've been really fascinated by this because I think that one of the big challenges in thinking non-humanly is that we don't have concrete sort of exercises for doing this, right? And so you can use kind of poetic imagination to get you there, but that only takes you so far. And there's something about integrating that into your life constructively and actually changing the way you see things, which is what, again, spiritual exercises has this interesting parallel with science, is that it's supposed to cultivate a different way of looking at the world. And you do that through habit, through looking at it repeatedly in a way that eventually becomes second nature. And in the spiritual exercise tradition, the way you cultivate perceptiveness to God and the spiritual non-human is by cultivating perceptiveness to the creaturely non-human. And this in turn transforms your perception so that you see yourself as yourself, not merely human, but entangled. And so you can then draw on, as a sort of contemporary reader, you can then go to the new materialists and see the same kind of ideas at work in someone like Jane Bennett's work on vibrant matter, where she talks about how, if you think about your body, it really isn't human. It's just lots of different non-human bits and pieces working together, co-laboring, and then to create this sort of thing which is and is not human. And I think the same thing is there in the spiritual exercise tradition. And it also gives you actual exercises, like things to do to transform your perception in this way. And I think that that's one of the things that we can look at from sort of resourcing our tradition. And then we can see how that kind of thinking is, of course, as I was mentioning before, and Willis also talked about that, it's paralleled and developed differently in lots of pre-modern or sort of what's sometimes called like a-modern ontologies, where it's still practiced. So there, it's not even a question of reviving some sort of, pre-modern tradition, which might feel quite kind of difficult to do, but you can just go there and talk to people who live this way today. So that's why I'm interested in magic and animism as ontologies that really sort of demonstrate criticism today, or critical thinking in the Anthropocene. And then we can also look at philosophers who've been attracted to this way of thinking. I mean, Jeff, you mentioned Bergson as somebody you've been interested in, and he wasn't thinking directly with these pre-modern ontologies in the way that we think of them as mystical, but he was intuiting similar ideas by his study of the Greek philosophers, especially. So yeah, there are lots of, there's like a sort of, when you start seeing this, you see that there's a kind of alternative genealogy of kind of ontology that has been pursuing this line and tried to sort of make sense of it in relation to all sorts of mindsets that make it very difficult. So yeah.
That's intriguing. I especially like your idea of the transformation of perception, and how we can get outside of the scientific way of trying to think of ourselves as removing ourselves from it in order to observe it as an outside observer. And I'd like to hear Willis and Ben both think on this in terms of how might we transform religious communities on the one hand to transform perception, or how do we transform scientists too to begin to and not just scientists, but scientifically literate culture to perceive the world differently in these sort of non-human ways, so to speak. Willis or Ben, whoever wants to go first. Yeah.
Well, okay. I'll take a crack at that. You asked big questions, Jeff.
Oh, sorry.
So those are great points. So let me say to the question, like, how do we transform religious practices or religious communities? So just obviously, it makes a lot of difference on who the we is. And so when I was hearing Simone talk, my mind was drawn to Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical. I'm not Catholic, so I don't identify right in the we of that. But one of the things I was really struck by as an observer was how his contemplative account of dominion restructures how dominion figures in establishing human dignity, a sense of humanity, human personhood, and begins to key it to something that Simone just identified, that perception of the non-human world as being a key practice and form through which one becomes properly human. That's a real possibility in Christian traditions, and it's expressed, maybe not to its fullness, but it's that direction is expressed in Laudato Si, and I think it's extraordinary. And so I would just say I'm interested in that. So as a scholar, I'm interested in where that's happening, and I'm looking for all those analogies that are happening in other kinds of communities and traditions where people are scholars, activists, whatever kind of agent, are looking for these possibilities that many people in many different contexts now realize are ever more important, that there's something about modernist conceptions of the human that is bad for us, bad for our world, bad for our health, bad for our personhood, and getting us into all kinds of just political and cultural dead ends. And we need to imagine our way out and find our way out. And I think there are these communities and agents finding their way out. And I think it's on us as scholars to find them, work with them, lift them up, push them, and so on.
Okay. Ben, have you thought much about how we transform the perceptive abilities of scientists, but specific, or more generally scientifically sophisticated culture?
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of Richard Feynman, who said, the scientific discovery is not eureka, Archimedes jumping out of his bathtub. The scientific discovery starts with, that's funny, just kind of noticing something that doesn't quite fit. And I think religion can kind of inform the kind of the imagination of people, and there are a lot of Christian scientists out there and other religions too. I think of the healing of the blind man at the pool on the seventh day, and the Pharisees are upset because it's the Sabbath, and I kind of sometimes feel like, well, Jesus could maybe have waited until the next day, and everybody would have been happy. And this sense that, in a sense, creation was not complete. And so it's part of our job to continue. The significance of the Sabbath there is that we are picking up where kind of God, in a sense, rested. He hasn't done everything for us. We are agents of creation. And once we see this blind man not as a cursed or a sinner or something who, he just got what he must have done something to be, to get this, but instead to see him as somebody who can be cared for, ministered to, then, all of a sudden we do make the blind to see. I think that's something, environmentalists can sometimes be a little down on progress, but we're not opposed to progress. There's lots of amazing things that become possible once you see, and that's why with Mario Molina and the ozone hole problem, there was a problem that we could not just see without instruments. But then once it became clear this was a problem, we came together and we said, look, we can do something about this. We want to do something about this. And that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, I think for science, it's often the case that you're right. It's sort of like, oh, what happened over there? I don't understand it. And then it usually takes a while for people to come to see the problem differently. And then suddenly they see a lot of other things differently by virtue of seeing that problem differently. And so I think that's in part what, our kind of recognition of human impact, and then now we're able to see it much more, required certain kinds of scientific habits, I think, of learning to see rightly, which of course is always a problematic thing. So I want to, we talked about this in terms of, I want to end with another big question. I'm going to end my formal questions. We still have questions popping up from outside. We're going to get to those as well. But I want to end with a kind of a big question, I guess, too. But we've talked about this in terms of philosophical ways of thinking. We've talked about it in terms of religious or theological ways or scientific ways of thinking. And there's a way in which there's almost, it's a really difficult thing to think synthetically. I think what COVID has pointed out to us is that we can think about COVID in so many different ways. We can think about it as primarily a problem of a virus, or we can think about it as to how we secure food sources, right? We could think about it in terms of international politics. We could think about it in terms of economics or technology even. Without technology, it couldn't spread around the globe the way it does. And so there seems to be no place in culture where we can kind of synthesize all of these different ways of seeing and different ways of knowing. And I'd like to hear you reflect on just the immensity of the problem when we're all trying to get the proverbial blind man gathering around the elephant sort of a problem here. How do we think synthetically about the whole? And what can we do to begin to think synthetically about the whole? Anyone? Simone?
I was wondering if it might be helpful to think quite sort of technically about this. I think ecological thinking is often thought of as the urgency to think about nature, to sort of talk about the natural world, right? And this often actually doesn't lead very far, right? Simply because we're talking about nature or suddenly deciding that we're going to have like a course on environmental ethics doesn't necessarily mean that we now become activists who do things and make things happen. I mean, Willis is smiling, and I'm sure this is something recognizes. So that's why it might be useful to become technical, because what does it mean to think ecologically? It doesn't mean thinking about nature, but thinking in a way that somehow changes, as Jeff was saying, our perception of the world. And there I've been very inspired by actually what some scientists do when they transform their perception to become sensitive to the things that they want to see. As Ben was describing it so beautifully, you can see something, but then you can see it with the eyes of somebody who knows like how it was made or what its purpose is. And I've been very, very struck by what Isabel Stengers, the historian of science and philosopher of science, has written about what she calls slow attention, and what essentially amounts to attentiveness as opposed to attention. So instead of sort of paying attention and bracketing out everything that's uninteresting except this one thing, we try and be open and we slow down, be receptive to whatever may lurk. That's one of the sort of technical things that we can do, which it sort of doesn't mean, what's nice about that, it doesn't depend on it thinking about something in specific, it's how we think.
So how do we, I'd like to, that's a really important point, I think, the slow attentiveness, the kind of purposeful, careful approach. And there's a way that's kind of opposed to the technological mindset, which kind of sees speed, rapidity, interact, inject, interject, you know. And it also kind of goes against a lot of the supposed technological fixes, and there's a certain kind of urgency we feel about the environmental crises that are looming. So how do we cultivate a sense of urgent slowness, urgent attentiveness, I guess? Willis, have you given any thought to that?
I appreciate that. I just want to commend Simone for being able to talk about slow attention while there's a toddler on her lap. It's pretty fantastic. That seems like the kind of capacity that we actually exactly need, which is the ability to think through the urgent thing right in front of you that's distracting. I mean, how many times have all of us heard people who are rightly quite concerned about climate breakdown, about mass extinction, saying, I don't have time to think about your complexity because we just have to focus on this thing. And that's the trick, right? Like you have to be able to respond. We all have to be able to respond, but also to as you say, ask those big questions, those synthetic questions. If I can say, you know, let me just name a liability that I see in non-synthetic thinking that really plagues Anthropocene discourse. When the way that humanity and humans becomes this obscuring context. So it's no longer particular societies or particular agents or particular ideas that are driving our problems and our breakdowns, but humans in general, which, you know, I like Jed Purdy, the legal thinker, has described it as a kind of moral laundering that happens because, you know, in relation to the climate crisis, we're not talking about the 100 known top emitters, we're talking about humans. And we're no longer talking about the particular populations that are vulnerable to sea level rise, not the Black lives lost in New Orleans because white supremacy structured vulnerability to flooding from hurricanes in a particular way and then incarcerated people in the city. We're not talking about that. We're talking about human vulnerabilities, right? And so I think there's a kind of there's a drive toward an easy synthesis that's driven by urgency that wants to talk about humans and the planet that keeps us from seeing the more complex synthesis that we have to be able to see, the way that injustice is not only attendant within this crisis, but driving the ways that we're drawn to think poorly about it. Yeah. So that when we talk about humanity, we have to think 4 different things at once about that, even that concept.
We mentioned, Ben, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, because I think, you know, to bring back to Laudato Si in the encyclical, which can be disconcerting to people, especially theologians. You know, you're expecting a theological monograph in Latin, and it's much more in a conversational style. So I came with a prop. You won't get the full experience because we're on Zoom, but that's okay. You know, I stole this from my children, the juggling balls, and often we want to just like lay these down and say, here's my things, these are the things I care about, and actually this is the one I care about more, so I'll put these away. When really what's needed is kind of a little bit of juggling. You know, to do this like this and it falls apart. Juggling is actually really hard, especially sitting in front of Zoom. And I was thinking about that wonderful book here for people with young children, The Clown of God, because I think that's part of what the Pope is trying to do in Laudato Si is keeping these different factors together, that there's kind of this personal factor of what is it that I can do, the more societal factor, okay, it's not enough for me to use a tote bag. We gotta, as a society, do things, organize things. I can give a loaf of bread, or I can work to a society where people have enough to eat. These two things, but also the third thing, what are our hopes and our dreams? What is our vision, which I think Simone's been sort of talking about. What am I attentive to? And it's interesting in Laudato Si, there's two suggestions I think sometimes people might kind of dismiss as a little trite. You know, one of the things he says to combat climate change, you know, he talks about biodiversity loss, all these heavy subjects, and then he says, you know, remember to say grace before dinner. You're like, well, how is that going to change anything? And actually, maybe it will. Maybe it will change the way we think about the gifts we receive. And then after that, he says, you know, observe the Sabbath. How does that change the way we think, even of our careers or our consumerism or all these things? So it's a juggling act of these three things. And I think sometimes we get into trouble when we argue with each other and say, actually, no, it's just this one factor, or it's this one, or we just gotta, here's the COVID-19 project for everybody, make yourself some juggling balls and practice.
Yeah. Or say grace. So, well, I mean, Laudato Si, I mean, you brought Laudato Si in, and as you were talking, it made me think, well, you know, what, and saying grace, I mean, what is that? It's giving thanks. And it also kind of makes you pause to think, from whence came this food, right? So it could give you pause to begin to think about your interconnectedness. But I guess one of the things that pops into my head, for this will be something for all of you to chime in on, is what does it do to our thinking to imagine reality as created, as opposed to just something that happened, right? Does it change our perception? What does it change? And is it important to have that dimension of thinking of it as gift, as not our own? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think if I can answer just briefly, I think it certainly does make a difference, but it makes a difference in different ways depending on how creation itself is imagined. Obviously, so here's, I think, a place that theology broadly construed really matters for how non-human relations between human and non-human are imagined. You know, if you think of creation as by the metaphor of fiat or instrumental obedience, you know, you may end up with something that works kind of well with a modern instrumentalism. If you imagine creation as something, I don't know, more relational or emergent or involving mutual responsibilities or delight or any of those kinds of features, it's going to light up a different kind of moral universe. And so I would just underscore that's a really fertile place for inquiry and conversation in all different kinds of theological communities.
Yeah, so the idea of creation itself is already embedded in certain understandings that may or may not have be instrumental and still produce the kind of problems that we have. So that's a very good point. Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Well, I think from the Psalm, you know, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and I think for you know, religious people, certainly there's this kind of awesomeness of the world, the things that we see. You know, at the moment we're very fortunate, you can see Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in your evening walk. So do this tonight, and if you have binoculars, you can see the Galilean moons on Jupiter. And you know, it's a scientific curiosity on the one hand, and on the other hand, it kind of reminds you of the immensity of the world and how fortunate we are on Earth. That, you know, that there's not many planets like ours that keep us alive. So I think it does. Thinking of creation, I think, helps us be more sensitive to those things, and maybe a little bit with the Beatitudes, you know, blessed are they that mourn. I think there can be we want a lot of different political points of view. We want diversity of opinion. But I think as a Christian, you do at some point have to be mournful, even if we disagree on the solutions, to be attentive to things. You know, biodiversity loss is something to be mournful about. And at the same time, there's a promise. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be consoled. So it's not just one side, it's together.
Simone, do you want to chime in on this, or should we go to the audience's questions?
I mean, I only had one thing to say, which is that the perception that the world is, that you're not the author of your own existence, so that there is a givenness. I mean, that's not, I think the real question is, do you have to be religious in order to perceive that? And I don't think you have to be, or rather, in that case, religiousness is something so inextricable from being human that there's no point in separating them. Maybe that's the sort of the deeper conversation, because and that comes back to the sort of the reason why there's so much religious talk really implicit in environmental discourse, is because the kind of the affect that we're talking about is one that just converges with religious experience at the deepest level, I think. So, yeah.
Well, we've got questions, and I'm going to turn to one that is specifically bioethical at this point, simply because it kind of goes right at the heart of some of the things that we've been talking about. And it's, that we're kind of, there are a couple of thinkers named Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu who say, oh, we have to morally enhance people, and we have to biotechnologically enhance people in order to get their morality right. We're going to intervene on the brain structures that control morality, so to speak, in order to get people to take the crisis of the climate change seriously. And so that is actually out there. And they say we may be, as the kind of animals that we are right now, unfit for the future is kind of their way of thinking. And so they call for a kind of technological, biomedical intervention on our moral life specifically, because maybe there's not time for this slow attentiveness that moral education requires. So, I mean, I'd like to hear you think about that, which is part of the urgency mindset that's going on, in light of what it takes to cultivate a kind of moral sensibility in the sort of traditional human sort of way.
I think it's a really dramatic way to address the problem of moral incompetence. So I don't know. I appreciate Savulescu for illuminating the depth of the challenge of moral competence. I think that the proposed pathway is not really serious in our current political and social possibilities. I don't think you don't get a shortcut to building moral competence. But I would say he's onto this. There might be a kind of technology that is needed to make us more competent, but I doubt it's the kind of thing that can be injected in us or genetically inserted into a person. So there's a real interesting imagination of the moral agent as this kind of single person who electively has these kinds of relations and actions with the world around them. And I suspect that the kind of technologies that we need are through better and different kinds of assemblies with human and non-human communities that realize within us the possibilities that we already have, but are just at the moment suppressed because we're in poor and corrupting communities.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Simone, are you going to say something? No, I guess not. Okay. Well,
no, I wanted. I mean, what Willis was talking about was what I heard anyway was the call for spiritual technologies, really. I mean, those are the technologies that, together with the technological fixes that we will have to work with, it's not a sort of either or question, right? It's not a binary of sort of spirit versus matter or something, but it's integrating the spiritual technologies with the techno fixes. Those will create the really sustainable technologies. I think there it's a question of, so going back to Jeff's question, there's a worry here about time and temporality when it comes to causality. So when we do something, we like to see direct results, and that's part of the kind of the modern scientific worldview, which is that we value direct, efficient causation, right? That I can see that I've done something, and then I can trust that this was really caused by me. And one is supposed to be suspicious of anything that's called indirect causation, sort of formal causation, and so on, because you can't see directly that that's the cause of the effect. And course, spiritual technologies are all about indirect causation. The whole thing about habit that we were talking about, you bless the food. Well, that doesn't directly do anything to your perception of food, but it might 10 years down the line, and it will certainly do so for your children who grow up perceiving food that way, right? But this is long-term stuff. So the anxiety is that when we start talking about spiritual technologies, it's long-term, they don't have immediate results. And so what's the point? Let's just throw the towel in, right? And then so we do that, and then we go straight, and then we go only with the sort of direct causation technologies. And the problem there is that, of course, they don't have long-term effects. So we have to find a way of balancing two of them.
All right, we have a question here that it's mostly directed at Simone, but anyone can chime in, of course. So it's the author of the question says, speaking from a Caribbean context, some have suggested that much of the ecological issues in the Caribbean are essentially caused by Euro-American negligence. Since you spoke about decolonization within ecology in the Anthropocene, the question is this. To what extent is the Anthropocene merely Occidentocene? In other words, it's a Western problem, so to speak, that of course permeates well beyond the West. That is where most of humanity's shaping of the world is done by the Western world, with so-called developing nations facing the brunt of their shaping. So to what extent is it a problem caused by the West that's being visited upon the rest of the world?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, this is one of the criticisms that's been brought to the Anthropocene, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's that not only is it elevates the human, but it also implies that the question of humanity is sort of a given, right? So that we know what it means to be human. And in fact, what we're talking about is the agency of one portion of humanity, mostly, right? Or one portion of humanity that identifies with certain ideals. So it's a really complicated question, and I know that's a way out of the question. It's not complicated. It's actually quite easy, and it becomes complicated when the speaker using the term Anthropocene includes all of humanity, when really they need to be addressing specific political questions and ideological questions that have to do with their political context. So there's a real danger here that science turns metaphysical before it's really kind of understood the political realities of metaphysics, really, I suppose. And which is why religion is a really good way of mediating this, because religion is communities that are anchored in places that have relationships to land and to people and to animals and so on. And so it's a way of keeping metaphysics and science anchored somewhere. They often can be unanchored. So yeah, no, but obviously I agree with the question. It is very much a sort of quote unquote Western problem. If it's not examined as such, the concepts that we're talking about, the Anthropocene, can be incredibly like unproductive, basically. It's not going to generate change in the way I think it was conceived.
Ben, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just to add to that, we need to be careful also not to be othering all the time. It's a sort of point the finger. I think that's really a key message we forget, that we shouldn't be like always pointing the finger. Take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of your brother's eye. And what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is it's not everybody in the West who is, doing this. It's actually, maybe we should just be calling it the wealthy people of scene or something. But at the same time, what's difficult with climate change is it will require, it will touch everybody. It will require everybody. And that's where I mentioned the Montreal Protocol earlier. That was much easier. We had 6 companies making CFCs. You bring the 6 in the room. The main manufacturer saw there was a profit motive. There was something in it for them. They did it. And here with climate change, it will require, I don't know if we can distribute a nasal spray of oxytocin, a little bit of love hormone to everybody in the morning, and that will make things easier, or habits, like Simone says. That, you know, religion has been, this is not the first time we have crises. You know, religions have long history of tools of dealing with this. I think of, you know, science now is rediscovering the value of meditation. And you're like, you know, people have been saying this for quite a long time, but, you know, this is great. This is great. Rediscover it now. And now with COVID is a good time to maybe rediscover adoration of the sacrament for Catholics, meditation, contemplation. All these things are tools that I think maybe scientists would be hesitant to embrace too much or poo-poo, but I think with the encyclicals and different traditions say, no, actually, they're part of the solution. They will, in fact, work in the long run.
Okay. So here's a question specifically about Christian ethicists. So I think, Willis, it might be interesting to have you speak to this, but for Christian ethicists, would adopting a pluralist approach to environmental issues be possible? And by pluralism, the questioner means adopting a common cause with non-Christians and non-religious ethical frameworks. On the one side, there's a certain attractiveness to this, especially as emphasized by Francis in the last two encyclicals. And then on the other side, there's a certain pessimism about this, especially given certain post-liberal claims to Christian otherness. So it might be interesting to have you speak to some of that, Willis.
Well, that's a really good question, which I'm happy to answer broadly in the affirmative, since I have argued publicly for just that, a kind of a pluralist sense of what Christian ethics should understand itself to do, in that insofar as we're engaging challenges to our tradition, ones that challenge our competence, then it's best to do that. It's most fertile to do that in dialogue with folks from other traditions, not expecting that you're going to create exactly common ground, but that you're looking for, you know, analogous moral competencies that are meaningful within those various traditions and communities, whatever practices those are, whatever concepts those may be, that help folks interpret and respond to, say, climate crisis. So yes. And then I will just affirm the other side of that. Yes, there's a huge liability to pluralist and pragmatist approaches, in that they can be captured by the initial framing of what the challenge is, what the problem is, right? So, you know, we just had to talk about whether Anthropocene is an illuminative or distortive concept, right? Yes, right there. There's one. And also definitely captive in several ways to political, bad channeling or manipulation or corruption of good faith dialogue and conversation between communities of difference. I guess, so if I can just come down with a quick bottom line on that, I feel deeply in thought and body that liability of my own pluralist and pragmatist commitments, and yet I don't really see the alternative. I think in the end, dialogue is the only place that someone like Pope Francis, understanding the encyclical as a part of pluralist dialogue of a really big challenge. It's really the only, it seemed to me, the only consistent way, consistent mode to present that treatise.
Right. Yeah. That sounds right. And it's, I mean, we have the tools we have, and we're gonna you know, pragmatically try the tools out, and of course on the fly we can shift our tools. We can begin to learn from other tools that other people are deploying. So I think that's a really good point, and this brings us to a question that someone has put in here, is specifically, you know, well, what are some other embodied practices which might cultivate capacities for new forms of ecological thinking? And it might be that we're going to get some of those from our own specific tradition, but in dialogue we might get others. So what do you think is out there that we ought to do? I mean, I think Ben points to some, just say grace, you know, keep the Sabbath in some you know, some way. What else is available to us, do you think?
I think on the practical side, there's a lot of things, and you know, without falling into the techno sort of happy, every solution is technical. I think there are a lot of things we can do right now. I know we recently had to change cars after a teenage mishap, but so we bought an electric car. It's great. You know, you don't have to be an environmentalist to do this. On the other hand, not everybody's in a position to do that. Maybe, and so there are a lot of resources online for things where we are moving in the right direction. This is the lesson of air pollution is, you know, the air we breathe in most of the developed world is much, much cleaner than it was before. And that's been great. And that hasn't led to the downfall of society. And I don't think anybody wants to go back to the way it was before. You know, the EPA was founded by a Republican president. And if you think the EPA should be disbanded, you should be given a one-way ticket to New Delhi in the winter and appreciate what that's done for us. So lots of things. And maybe also to chime into what Willis was saying earlier about pluralism, which I think is true. But also you know, for Catholics at least, we believe in the unity of truth, and the scientists often in evolution we kind of like, you know, convergent evolution. So they're not. It's not either or. It's both and. That it can be different paths leading in the same direction. So.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that, a strong confidence and trust in the unity of truth, I think, should make one more inclined to reconciliation to pluralism and pragmatism if you have a sufficiently long-run view.
So, here's a question that kind of goes in a slightly different direction, and it'd be interesting to hear you think on it. So, you know, so it's all, you know, we've been talking about changing our ways, changing our attunements, our attentiveness, and things like that. And this person asks a question that says, well, do we really need to reinvent the wheel? And the person points to the idea, the metaphor of the church's doctrine kind of unfolds dynamically, like a plant that's growing. And perhaps for us Christians, the goal is not so much to break our heads trying to seek new frameworks out there as we face ecological crises, but rather to go back to basics, fraternity, the commandments, practices, recognition of our sinfulness, and bring them to bear as on the things that we face, and see how they can be fleshed out and articulated in continuity with, you know, specifically here, I'm thinking the person is thinking of the Catholic spiritual tradition. So can we just draw on something we already have hold of, in other words, and trust the church's teaching that these things unfold over time in the development of doctrine, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that one of the red herrings in this debate is trying to find the perfect worldview or ontology that's going to solve our spiritual problems, so that it's a question of kind of finding a way of being that we just follow religiously, and then suddenly we become the people that we want to be in terms of environmentalism. And we're never going to find that perfect worldview because they're all, you know, human and flawed and whatever. We have to do the worldview that we're in and do it well. So if we're Christians and we're Catholic and we have a wealth of literature, we've talked about some of it already, at our fingertips, we just have to start actually doing it, activating it, reading it, but experimenting with it as well. I mean, Willis said so nicely, like, we have to be historians of this stuff, but we also have to be practitioners. And we just have to do it well, wherever we are, whichever tradition we are. It's not converting to another denomination isn't going to solve it, right? We just have to do the spiritual landscape where we are, do it well, understand it, really be attentive to it. And there's going to be aspects of it that are going to be disappointing. And those are the ones we have to try and transform ourselves. So I agree with the question. It's not a question of reinventing the wheel. And when we think that that's happening, when we see that happening, we have to be wary and ask if that is actually helping and helping our transformation, our perceptions to be transformed.
Yeah, I disagree with Tolstoy on this point. Tolstoy says all unhappy families are unhappy in different ways, and all happy families are the same. I think no, happy families are all very different. the saints were all very different, and there's lots of different things we can do. And I like to bike, so I would probably bike to work irrespective of climate change, but it happens to be good for climate change too, so that's a good thing. Maybe you hate biking, well, don't take up biking, do something else. But there's different practices that happen. But I do think, think of the angels coming down at Christmas and above the manger, and they sing, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to people of goodwill." And I think of that, pax omnibus bone voluntatis. Are we people of goodwill? Are we making an effort? God will, well, I don't want to open up a can of worms, but I think he does say peace to people of goodwill.
Well, one final question. It's been such a conversation. We could go a lot longer, but I'm just going to end with one question. It's asking you for some recommendations. So there's been a lot of thinking and writing about other cultures and communities and how they're imagining things, including the Christian mystical literature. So can you guys make some recommendations of 1 or 2 books or articles that you found helpful that have good current literature reviews out there that might be useful to all of our people who are listening in here?
Is it right if I go first?
Yeah, go for it.
I was recently reading James Perkinson's Political Spirituality in an Age of Eco-Apocalypse, which is really wonderful for thinking the Christian tradition as itself a kind of indigenous way of thinking, and then bringing it into conversation with the amodern and the non-modern. Yeah, it's really brilliant.
Say it one more time, Simone, so we can get it.
So the author is called James Perkinson, and the book is called Political Spirituality in an Age of Eco-Apocalypse. I think I got that right.
Okay. Political spirituality in an age of eco-apocalypse. Okay, good. Willis or Ben?
Well, I would, 2 books come to mind. One, Inside the Tradition, Doug Burton Christie's Blue Sapphire of the Mind is a lovely, it's a reading of the Desert Fathers in sort of conversation with contemporary environmental thought. And so he draws out both ideas and also specific spiritual practices, sort of reframed for contemporary